welcome to Watch Mojo. And today, we'll be counting down the top 5 ways that historicity Red Dead Redemption 2 is an open-world, picturesque story game by Rockstar Games which invites the player to absorb themselves into the changing world of the United States Gilded Age, or rather, the last years of the Wild West. The series began with Red Dead Revolver, released in 2004, which imitates a spaghetti western bounty hunter in the 1880s. Red Dead Redemption was released in 2010, following the story of John Marston, a retired outlaw who needs to hunt down his former gang members in order to protect his family. Red Dead Redemption was so successful that Rockstar released their most popular game yet, aside from the GTA series, Red Dead Redemption 2, which was received as the pinnacle of open-world story games, setting a new bar for developers worldwide. It had one of the highest grossing opening weekends ever, bringing in US $725 million and breaking even within its first week released. Red Dead Redemption 2 is a prequel to the first Red Dead Redemption, but comes after Red Dead Revolver. Its events mainly occur during 1899, where you play as Arthur Morgan, a member of the Vanderlyn Gang, the gang that John Marston is a part of. The game, depending on the player's actions, is a redemption arc game for Arthur Morgan, who contracts tuberculosis and realizes he needs to become a better person in order to help the other members of the gang before it is too late. The player witnesses the downfall of the gang and ends as John Marston, where then Red Dead Redemption 1 picks up. It seeks to evoke the Wild West and the idea of progress in Gilded Age America, and seems to be a project begun for profit but beloved for its historicity and its characters. Originally played by video game fans only, similar to Rockstar's other games, its popularity has surpassed the video game world into popular media. Red Dead Redemption 2 is a game in which players have access to seemingly endless active historical environment, but the impact of this history comes through in ways in which the characters interact with events of the story, namely the frontier myth and Western expansion. In Playing American, Shopmeyer studies open-world video games, including Red Dead Redemption, which provides us with the technical terms to describe the player's role in the game. According to Shopmeyer, an open-world game organizes its game space as a single, entirely traversable contiguous space, often vast in its dimensions, which frequently comes with a high degree of freedom for player action. Red Dead Redemption 2 also counts as an open-ended game, which means that the player can still explore and act within the world even after narrative missions or story components have ended. Red Dead 2 is immersive, and the world continues on whether driven by the player or not, which Galloway describes as the ambient act, or by diegetic machine and operator acts. The machine acts are automatic, run by the game code itself, which includes ambiance like trees blowing in the wind, but also non-player character actions that pull the player into the environment. Operator acts are actions taken by the player that help drive the game or have an effect on the in-game environment. These acts can push and pull with each other, and gameplay is never entirely diegetic or non-diegetic, operator or machine, which creates an active, realistic environment for the player to explore. As you can see from these clips, the effect is almost total immersion in the universe and historical setting. It takes on a life of its own, and ultimately the function of the game itself makes it automatically attractive to the player. Other history-based games, such as the Assassin's Creed series, also have a very similar function. So why does Red Dead Redemption 2 seem to have a more all-encompassing effective adoration for this time period than other games have traditionally seen in popular media? In my opinion, the adoration and immersion for the Red Dead Redemption universe comes not from the historicity itself, but from empathy for the characters. In observations of fan behavior, it is not entirely the environment, topic, or setting alone that fans adore, but their lasting impressions about the events of the game are through their effects on the main characters and the characters' actions. The main characters are witty, sarcastic, quick on their feet, tough and yet lovable. They all resemble the hero with trauma that causes a hard shell, but you can slowly reveal something more gentle underneath, and fans love the drama of their personal lives. Aside from discussions of the historicity, if one wants to discuss the work that Red Dead does on the player, it truly does come down to the ways that the player relates to the characters. When analyzing the characters of Red Dead Redemption 2 in her dissertation, scholar Heather Rose Moser references the way that actors play a character on the theater stage. They recognize that the character is not them, but also not them. The player is not Arthur, but is also not Arthur while controlling his in-game decisions. As Moser puts it, there is a transfer from a spectator to an active participant for both an actor and the player. The player begins as a spectator to the actions of the narrative and sympathizes with the plights of the gang and Arthur, but as they progress further, this sympathy becomes a direct reflection on themselves. The player develops an emotional connection with Arthur, which then produces reactions. Players will develop a connection with Arthur as they identify with him and insert their own morality when making in-game decisions. This leads to them feeling the emotions of the protagonist and having empathy for them, which leaves a neurological impression. Dan Houser, one of the main writers of the Red Dead Redemption series and a head of Rockstar Games, notes that the player has the option to skip cutscenes, narrative, and historical pieces of the story mode, which he refers to it as it can just be mud, blood, and gore. Houser stating this and reminding us that players can in fact skip these scenes proves that the empathy that the player has for the character in order to choose to listen and make decisions plays the largest role in the true historical commentary of the game, and that they might not experience pieces of historical dialogue, like examples I'll come to in a second, if they choose to skip these cutscenes. If there was simply an open-ended world of 1899 America, I'm sure players would enjoy the freedom of experiencing the time period at their own pace, but most historical information and the impact comes through by ways of interaction with the characters. There's too much to unpack about the historicity shown through the characters, or else we'd be here all day, but through their dialogue and actions is where the player gets the most sense of the social and cultural aspects of the time period. The West has been a fixture in the media since before the Gilded Age even ended, and has been seen in many different forms over time. Jim Kitces describes the genre as a varied and flexible structure, a thematically fertile and ambiguous world of historical material shot through with archetypal elements which are themselves ever in flux. Rockstar drew heavily on Western iconography for Red Dead Redemption 2. Despite the West being a flexible genre, the Red Dead Redemption universe includes almost every parallel and Western trope, but it does tend to follow the violence and masculinity of revisionist Western movies from the 1960s. Tropes such as duels and card games are included to offer choice and activity in the realistic open world, but they're also there to simply evoke the West with no real narrative consequences or gameplay impact. Rockstar Games ensured that the game is almost entirely accurate, save for experiences that may not have happened directly in 1899, but occur in a similar time period that have been inserted for the player experience. For example, similarly to the duels and the card games, the player can interact in a surprise scene when it happens to spawn with the Ku Klux Klan at various spawn points around the map. This is not a planned interaction and it has no part in the story, but it is simply there as kind of an Easter egg, I suppose you could say, and so that Rockstar could insert a notion of historical authenticity and give an example or an idea or an interaction of some of the social sentiments that are happening around this time. The player feels as though they are a part of the West not only due to the immersive environment, but also due to recognizable ideals of the West in other media. Esther Wright argues that the Red Dead Redemption historic experience is not just bound in Western Romanticism, but also implicitly relies on ideologies that accompany narratives of progress and civilization, bound up as they are with the frontier myth, white supremacy, and colonialism. In Red Dead Redemption, Rockstar Games foregrounds narratives of progress right from the get-go. Wright argues that the notion of civilizing and a changing America is automatically an attempt at establishing an authentic historical truth about what was happening in America at the time, attempting to not only preload potential players with information about the game's historical truths, but to negotiate and manage expectations for the game's representation of the past. She references Trachtenberg, who writes that civilization in America was brought about by a combo of violence and increasing corporatization of daily life, which is central to the ideology of the game, as the Vanderlyn Gang is specifically against modern capitalism in favor of freedom. The player participates in the idea that westward expansion provided a safety valve for white Americans wishing to escape the pressures of modernizing life, as John, Arthur, and the Vanderlyn Gang exist in an imagined liminal space between modernity and the untamed past, catered to white male action and manifest destiny. The progress narrative applies to the game's representation of indigenous groups with fictional Wapiti Indian Reserve, in which we see several instances of white genocidal violence. The American treatment of the indigenous arises in dialogue, missions, and the visual environment. In some instances, the racism is overt, but in others, it is less so. Despite the insertion that Arthur, John, and the gang are against the mistreatment of disadvantaged people, they still participate in what Wright refers to as a microscale recreation of racist genocidal violence. The gang is aligned with them to play Indian, or in other terms, associate the extinction of the indigenous with the extinction of the outlaws in order to negotiate their own identities. Keller refers to it as hardly a radical revision that disingenuously places Native Americans in the periphery to include them in historical authenticity, but continue to victimize the Vanderlyn Gang. There are many other hints at social inequalities as well, which the main characters don't necessarily agree with, but tend to brush off. This again places them at the center of good and bad narratives, adding to the idea that they are isolated and progressive in a world changing for the worse. When considering the emotional connection that the player has to the characters, they often don't recognize the place that this connection has put them in. In other words, they don't consider the historical position of the gang critically due to their attachment to them. They don't consider the positioning of the gang as simultaneously white male saviors and victims while casting other groups to the side. Fans see funny outcasts that they can relate to and do not consider their positioning the way that other groups are pushed to the peripheral, or the implications of the progress of this oh so cruel world that supposedly leaves the Vanderlyns behind. While Wright does acknowledge that it is not Rockstar Games' job to undo the decades of frontier myth with a single video game, the intentions of explicit in-game events and promotional material requires extra critical thought about their intentions. In Red Dead Redemption 2, progress in America becomes simultaneously a tool to critique American colonialism, but also to exploit it with the goal of historic authenticity, which the player is often unable to reflect on due to their attachment to the story and the characters. In conclusion, the Red Dead Redemption universe, and Red Dead 2 specifically, both have an endless amount of historical content to analyze, whether that be in the story, in the setting, in the characters, anything. we would be here all day if I tried to cover it. The player can endlessly explore the immersive environment set out for them and become attached to these characters to feel the same emotions that the characters did while experiencing the events of the story. Within the game, though, Rockstar implemented a number of narrative occurrences to satisfy their motivation of historic authenticity that places the characters of the story in a position to participate in harmful historical events or ideologies, or to brush them off entirely, which is often unrecognized, harmfully so, by the player. In the same vein, these historical events fuel the myth of progress and the American colonial culture. Red Dead Redemption 2, despite its possible historical shortcomings, is an excellent game to play if one is aware of the subtle context required to avoid deception by Rockstar's sneaky goals in the name of historic authenticity.
I got some jelly beans. You like jelly beans?